Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Storybox, where I, your host, Jay Phantom, has the utmost privilege and honor to unbox the amazing stories of some incredible people from all walks of life and experiences. I'm delighted and grateful that you're here today. Now let's dive into the Storybox and hear more about our guest today.
Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure, sir. And before we dive into, I guess, why you do what you do and all the science behind it. Now, I didn't study science in school. In fact, I actually failed it. But I am very fascinated, very curious about this topic of addiction. But I usually have one question that I love asking people to start off with, and that is, what does success look like to you?
Great question. I see success as living a fulfilled life where one has no regrets.
Where did this idea of success come from for you? Was it more of a gradual thing over time, or was there like a catalyst moment somewhere for you?
I think it was a series of learnings through failing.
Yeah.
In the sense of, I grew up without a whole lot. My mom raised 4 kids by herself. And so, learning about things where it's, money doesn't buy you happiness. Not that I have, that I'm extremely rich, but I'm live comfortably, and that's not what leads to happiness and success. Trying to garner people's attention and get a bunch of likes on a YouTube or a TED Talk video, that doesn't, you can get those things, but they often, at least for me, feel empty afterwards, and often just prompt me to want more. And so here, those failures, or kind of learning like, oh, that doesn't do it, that doesn't do it, that doesn't do it. And then also seeing what does do it, where, I'd started meditating at the beginning of medical school and started learning about my own mind and how my mind worked, and started seeing that there's actually, success on a moment-to-moment basis, rather than, like in 20 years, I will be this, and fill in the blanks, which hopefully this makes me happy. Really, it's about the connection with people on a moment-to-moment basis. Trying to do the best work I can on a moment-to-moment basis. And ultimately, what I found most kind of really fulfilling is helping people and being of service. And that seems to be, on a momentary basis, very rewarding, and also one that leads me, feeling fulfilled and getting to sleep easily at night.
I love that. Where did this, I guess, passion and desire come from to learn more about the brain? And why did you want to actually study mindfulness, addiction, how the brain works? So why did you want to do that?
Yes, I did this joint MD PhD program where you do a couple of years of medical school, and then you do your PhD for as long as it takes to forget everything you learned in medical school. And I was studying molecular biology during my PhD years, looking at the intersection between immunology and endocrinology and neuroscience. I was really interested with, just fascinated by the question of like, why do we get sick when we get stressed? I actually that led to a big interest of mine. And I started studying it, at the level of the mouse. Can we knock out specific genes to understand the interaction between stress and the immune system? We can learn those things, but ultimately, I remember somebody asking me the question like, well, how do we know this applies to humans? When we discovered a few things. And I couldn't answer the question. I could say, well, maybe, but I couldn't actually answer that. And at the same time, I was meditating myself and starting to realize how little I knew about my own mind. And as I learned more about that, finished my PhD, went back to finish up medical school, I started seeing the intersection between where people were really struggling with addictions and habits, and where there was a big deficit in our knowledge base around, how we can actually change habits for the better. We were notoriously horrible at treating addictions in the addiction psychiatry field and in the addiction medicine field. So I remember taking this plunge where I decided to study mindfulness And I remember somebody telling me that it was going to kill my career because, I'd published well, I'd, learned a bunch of things in molecular biology. And they said, well, you're an expert here. But it really didn't feel like the place where I wanted to wake up every morning and get excited to go to work. I wanted to try something where I really could see and test the effects of these things that I was seeing in my own life in actual humans to see if this could actually affect not only my patients in my clinic, but do clinical research to show that this was generalizable, not just something that happened in my clinic. And so I shifted my whole career to studying mindfulness. This was during residency training. I had to retool to learn neuroscience, to learn neuroimaging, to learn clinical trials, but it was a really exciting time. Not that it wasn't stressful, because I was doing something completely new, but it really felt like the right thing for me to do.
So speaking about the challenges involved with actually studying mindfulness, addictions and everything, because you mentioned there for a moment, it hadn't really been done before and there hasn't been much research. So how did you go about doing it? Like, what was the process like in studying it in the first place? Did you know where to begin?
I had some guesses, some educated guesses as to where to begin. And those came from my own personal mindfulness practice. So I've been practicing mindfulness for about 10 years myself personally, just learning the ins and outs of it to understand, my own mind. And I started to see parallels when I was seeing patients where they were speaking the same language that I'd been learning in my own meditation practice. They're talking about craving and clinging and struggles with getting attached to, to perseverating about using drugs and whatnot. And I just thought, this can't be a coincidence that, this ancient Buddhist language, this ancient Buddhist psychology is lining up with my patients who are struggling. And at the same time, the techniques that I'd learned to help my patients, just tell, if somebody wants to quit smoking, just tell them to set a quit date from 2 weeks from now, give them some medications to maybe help with the withdrawal, and then wish them good luck. I mean, there are a few other things, but the smoking rate, the smoking cessation metrics at the time, the average person that tried to quit, stayed quit a year later was only 5% of people that could actually maintain abstinence. And with other drugs of abuse, it really wasn't much better. So here, all of these things were lining up where, I was like, well, let's study, this ancient Buddhist psychology. It can't do worse than what we're doing right now.
Wow. So speaking about this topic of mindfulness and what mindfulness really is and what it entails, did you discover, what were some of the things that you discovered that were new in your research as opposed to when you first started?
Well, one thing I learned, so this was already known, this wasn't something I discovered, but one thing I learned was that mindfulness is really about changing one's relationship to one's thoughts and emotions. So I had formerly trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, where there's the saying, catch it, check it, change it, which is kind of the one-liner on CBT, where you catch a cognition, you check to see if it's true, and then you change it to a different cognition. But what had been recently discovered at that time was that the cognitive behavioral therapy relies on the prefrontal cortex, the kind of cognitive control part of the brain, and that part of the brain goes offline when we get stressed or when we get anxious. And these are the major predictors of relapse. So here we were relying on a part of the brain that is unreliable, especially when it comes to addiction. So that was one thing that was being discovered as I was going through residency and I was learning about this. And the other thing was that mindfulness, isn't about changing anything. It's about changing our relationship to whatever it is. So if it's a craving, we change our relationship to a craving. And I remember I had a patient, I was working at the VA hospital in the US, this is the Veterans Administration Hospital. And my patient came in and he said, "Doc, if I don't smoke a cigarette, my head's going to explode." And I was a little panicked. And I was like, well, what do I do? So we went up to my whiteboard and I just had him start describing what it felt like, what head exploding felt like. And I would write it down and then have him describe it if it was getting more intense or less intense. And it got more and more and more and more intense. And then it started to peak and get less and less and less and less intense. And what he discovered, and this was, I was just kind of playing out some of my own mindfulness practices in real life. What I had learned was that, as you notice these thoughts, emotions, and sensations, that they come and go on their own. You don't have to do anything about them. For my patients, typically when that craving got really strong, they would smoke a cigarette, and they would associate smoking a cigarette with making the craving go away, which it would do temporarily. But at the same time, it would perpetuate the habit loop. Now, this was also known, operant conditioning, reinforcement learning. Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize in 2000 showing that this is evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. So what I started to do is bring all of this stuff together. And I noticed a parallel between the ancient Buddhist psychology and the modern day concepts of operant conditioning, and actually published a paper on this back in 2012, 13, something like that, where we showed, this ancient Buddhist psychology is actually describing the same thing as modern day psychology. So that parallel, that link that we made, I worked with a Buddhist scholar, a Pali scholar on this to make sure that we were getting this right, was showing that, the Buddhists had this concept, this framework that was basically playing out in modern day, and that we could actually start to use this framework as a testable hypothesis. Could we actually target this operant conditioning loop? And so started employing mindfulness training, did a study with alcohol and cocaine use disorder, found that mindfulness was as good as gold standard treatment for preventing relapse, did a larger randomized control trial where we offered mindfulness training for smoking cessation, got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. And here we could show mechanistically that mindfulness was specifically targeting this habit loop, where it was helping people be with a craving, just like that patient that I mentioned. And instead of acting on it, they could bring in just observation, awareness, and notice the thoughts, notice the emotions, notice the sensations, watch them come and go and not act them out. And in fact, this could decouple the craving and smoking. So here we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. We could link this up mechanistically. We could then package this into app-based mindfulness training, where we made this app called Craving to Quit. And we even made one for eating called Eat Right Now, where we got a 40% reduction in craving-related eating. And there we even showed mechanistically that you could decouple the craving and eating. So I know I just mentioned a bunch of things, but that's what we started to notice, was that we could line up the ancient Buddhist psychology with modern psychology. We could use that to provide a mechanistic framework, target that specifically. And through targeting it, we could get huge changes in behavior.
There's so much to unpack in that. And what you were just saying there, I guess for me, trying to distinguish between, you mentioned habit and then addiction, the correlation that, or is there something different about a habit and addiction, and trying to distinguish between, okay, well, people say create good habits in your life, but then you also say that you can also create bad habits in your life, which then does that lead to addiction?
Yes. So I learned this very simple definition of addiction back in residency, which is still informed today, basically the same definition, which is continued use despite adverse consequences. So here we can see, forming a habit around tying your shoes, for example, good habit, right? No adverse consequences there. You're less likely to trip. Yet we could also see, if somebody got caught up in smoking cigarettes as a way to cope with stress, that formed a bad habit. So there's continued use despite adverse consequences. Somebody was having health effects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what we also noticed was that you can actually even form habits around anxiety. So this is a real light bulb moment for me. Working with anxious patients, we're supposed to use these medications. They work for some people, not for everybody. And some of the medications can actually be addictive, like benzodiazepines. So the recommendation is only to use those for a very short period of time to help somebody through a very short period of anxiety. So we can't use those long term. So I needed to start understanding, how to help these patients. And when we were doing clinical studies with our Eat Right Now app, people started saying that they were eating because of anxiety, and that anxiety was triggering eating. So I looked back at the literature and started to see back in the 1980s, this guy, T.D. Borkovec, was talking about how anxiety is perpetuated in the same habitual manner as stress eating or even smoking. And so we developed this Unwinding Anxiety app. won't go through all of this because I know we don't have a ton of time on this interview. But basically, we did a study with anxious physicians. We got a 57% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scores, and then we followed that up with a randomized control trial of people with generalized anxiety disorder. Now, folks with GAD, they're like the Olympians of worry. They are really good at worrying. 63% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scores, whereas with people who just did the regular clinical care treatment as usual, they only had a 15% reduction.
Wow.
So here, this was all just lining up really, really beautifully. And all of the underlying mechanism here is bringing awareness to the process and seeing that these things, smoking or overeating or being anxious aren't actually that rewarding. And that actually taps into the brain's natural reward-based learning system.
So speaking about that, do you think that all addictions are based on a chemical imbalance, or is there something more to that?
Well, all addictions have to do with our neurochemistry. So in one sense, there is we can say that general statement, all addictions have to do with underlying neurochemistry. We also know that generally speaking, I don't know any exceptions to this, is that the dopaminergic reward system is involved in addictions. And all known drugs of abuse are shown to affect the dopamine system in one way or another. Interestingly, eating also affects the dopamine system, as does social media.
Here we go.
So there have been some studies, and I wrote about this in my book, The Craving Mind, where people have done studies simulating Facebook, basically, and they get activation of the nucleus accumbens, which is part of this dopamine system. They can actually show that they can predict the amount of time people spend on social media based on how much their nucleus accumbens is activated. There's another study with Instagram showing that the more likes you get on Instagram, the more your dopaminergic system is activated. And so, it's like, basically, it's not just chemicals that can affect this dopamine system. It can be behaviors as well, such as going on social media.
Which is a fascinating line of thought as well. And I was reading some of the information that Natalie provided for me regarding Gen Z, millennials, and all that sort of stuff about the stress factor and why we stress is not just because of COVID. It's because of what is portrayed mostly on social media, which is the negative information that we're being bombarded with, which then can lead to more anxiety, more stress. Like we feel like the world's going to end. Our life is crazy, and we don't have this sense of balance anymore because of this and this app. And the difference between Gen Z, millennials, and my parents' generation and all that, having to go through what stress looks like. Young people are struggling with higher amounts of stress nowadays, anxiety, than what my parents did because of social media. So how do we combat that?
Yes, it's a great question. And the first part of the answer there is we have to understand we have to know how our minds work. If we don't know how our minds work, we can't possibly work with them. So let's use social media as an example. Our fear is actually a good learning mechanism. It helps us survive. So we often, fear gets coupled with something else. So fear is kind of the old brain phenomenon. It's, it helps us remember where food is. It helps us remember where danger is. Yet that system, layered on top of that, is this prefrontal cortex that I mentioned earlier. Now, the prefrontal cortex helps us survive in a different way, through thinking and planning. So it kind of simulates the future based on past experiences. Yet when we don't have any past experiences to go on, that thinking and planning part of the brain starts to spin out in what if scenarios. So for example, let's use the pandemic as an example. None of us that are alive have experienced a pandemic of this magnitude before. So there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of what if going on there. And our thinking and planning brain starts thinking, what if this for, am I going to lose my job? What's my pension going to look like? What's this and what's this and what's this? And there are a lot of studies. ShareCare even did a study in Australia. They partnered, I think, with Executive Health Solutions, where they found that, you ready for this? 67% of employees we're worried about COVID-19, primarily due to potential loss of employment, impact on their superannuation, difficulty paying bills, all this stuff. This is a worldwide phenomenon because we don't know what's going to happen. So there's our thinking and planning brain. It's got its fear mechanism that is getting fed uncertainty as a substrate. And when you feed it that, you get anxiety. On top of this, so this is where social media comes in. You can distance yourself, 2 meters from somebody to prevent the spread of a physical virus, right? You can wear a mask. You can make sure you're socially distanced. Yet with there's this thing called basically social contagion, where it's the spread of affect or emotion from one person to another. Well, somebody can sneeze on your brain from anywhere in the world, right? If you go on social media and everybody's panicking, right? If you pick up your weapon of mass distraction and you go on there because you're stressed and you check your social media feed and everybody else is stressed, you're just going to catch that contagion from them. So that's where anxiety can even turn into panic, this wildly unthinking behavior because we see everybody else panicking and then suddenly we're panicking simply because we've been scrolling through our phone.
I don't know what it's been like over in the States, but we had this mass problem. It is a problem because it's sort of like the second wave of it is happening now. And you just ask yourself, why is this happening? But we had this toilet paper epidemic. So we had oh my goodness. I don't understand it. Like of all things for people to go crazy over and to fear missing out on, it was toilet paper. So I'm curious about this thought of fear, because fear essentially is a good thing in a way because it protects us from dangers. It's like fight or flight syndrome in a way, but how can we sort of manage that? So what are the things that we can put in place, the mindfulness tips and tricks that we can do to make ourselves aware, okay, fear is not exactly going to be a bad thing in our life all the time. What are some of the things that you recommend that we do?
Well, it's funny you mentioned the toilet paper because that social contagion might have been caught from somewhere in the United States. It was one of the first things that people started hoarding in the United States for no reason. And my guess, my working hypothesis is that somebody was at some grocery store early on when everybody was freaking out, and somebody else went to the grocery store and they had their list of things to buy. And then they see this person hoarding toilet paper. And then their thinking brain goes offline and they think scarcity. Oh no, I need to get toilet paper, even though they probably don't need it. And there's no reason that we would run out of toilet paper. So they run and get toilet paper. The next person sees them. And then somebody posted on social media saying, everybody better hurry. They're trying to help out and say, everybody better hurry up and get toilet paper. Yet they're spreading that social contagion around, toilet paper. That's just an example of that. So what can we do? Well, the first thing we have to do is understand how our minds work, right? So if we can start to see that we're being triggered, we're at the grocery store, we've got our list, and we see somebody with a cart piled high with toilet paper, the first thing we need to do is pause, right? In medical school, I learned this thing where if somebody is having a heart attack, the first thing that I'm supposed to do is take my own pulse. Now that seems paradoxical, but the idea there is if I'm not calm, I'm actually going to make things worse for the person having the heart attack.
Them out and
Yeah. So if I can pause and make sure that I'm grounded and I'm calm and collected, then I can actually proceed to help, right? And if I'm freaked out, I'm actually a liability. I'm getting in the way. So here, I love the simple mindfulness practice of just kind of feeling your feet, right? Our feet tend to be an anxiety-free zone. So, and I've had a number of people, that have been in my meditation groups or people that I've taught or whatever, practice this where it's just like, feel your feet. What do your feet feel like? And get really curious. Oh, are they warm? Are they cold? Is one foot warmer than the other? Are they tingling? Can I feel the pressure of my feet on the floor or the ground? Literally grounding ourselves in our feet. So that's really the essence of mindfulness, is being present with what is. And as we ground ourselves in our feet, that helps that wave of adrenaline, that adrenaline surge to pass, so that we can actually keep our thinking brain online and then we can proceed. oh, I'm at the grocery store, somebody else is panicking. I don't need to panic because we can, at that moment, I can actually think as compared to just going on survival mode. So there are that's just one example of a bunch of different, very short, simple practices that we can do to simply ground ourselves in the present moment. I'll mention one other that I absolutely love. And actually the TED Talks, they just put out a short video on Twitter where they did a beautiful diagram of this. Because I'd done a short YouTube video on this, and then they asked if they could kind of republish it. But basically, it's called five finger breathing, where as you breathe in, you trace up. You take your index finger and you trace up the outside of your pinky finger. As you breathe out, you trace down the inside of your pinky finger, and as you breathe in, you trace up the outside of your ring finger, and so on. And you basically, over the course of 5 breaths, you trace your entire hand, 5 fingers. Next 5 breaths, you can trace the other way. So in 10 breaths, what we can do is we can use up all of our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, this working memory part of our brain, to really stay grounded in the present moment. And what that does is it fills up the space so that our anxiety brain, our anxiety habit doesn't have time to, or doesn't have the space to actually be spinning out. And then when we finish, our physiologies calm down. And even if the anxious thinking comes back online, it has much less of an emotional bite, because it is, they're just thoughts, they're just emotions, as compared to, oh no, we're in freak out mode. So those are 2 very simple examples that, feeling our feet, doing a 5-finger breathing, bunch of different mindfulness practices that can really help us ground in the present moment so that we can not get caught up in the social contagion of anxiety and panic.
I love the breathing aspect, because that's one of the things I didn't do in high school, because HSC came around, and I remember I was so stressed, so anxious that I was going to fail these exams because I wasn't exactly the smartest kid in school. And I was so worried about this aspect of failure and what was going to happen to my life if I did fail these exams, having to repeat and all that sort of stuff, that I thought I was having a heart attack. Like, I felt like my chest was caving inside me. I felt the tingling and all this sort of stuff. I wasn't really breathing properly. And I remember the school had to call an ambulance, I think 3-4 times in that year, all because I was having panic attacks. And the ambulance officers were like so kind to me. They're like, "You're not having a heart attack, Jay. You are just stressed and anxious. Remember," she told me this deep breathing exercise. She's like, breathing doesn't come from the chest, it comes from the stomach. So make sure that you in and out 5 times. It's almost like that 5-second thing, 5-second rule. It's like, if you feel like you are being too anxious or too stressed, count to 5 and then take a deep breath in and out slowly. And then that's what I love doing. It just brings me back to a place of what you were saying, is being mindful of your present moment and being grounded in that, being grounded in reality. Don't focus too much on the what ifs, because the what ifs will create more stress, more anxiety. I was in a relationship last year, just really quickly, and all she would do is focus on the what ifs. And I was like, I'm not a what if person. I'm a what is person. I tend to focus on what the present moment rather than the future. I mean, I have a plan and a vision for the future, but that I don't allow that to worry me, because it hasn't happened yet. I focus on what can we do right now to help improve our situation right now. And I think that is an important message and lesson for a lot of young people to understand, because with social media, it's all about how can I look a certain way for tomorrow, or in the past as well. What's past is past. People are seeing photos from that you posted weeks before. People are seeing photos that you're posting today, and they're anticipating what you're going to post tomorrow or the next day. It's like this constant, and they're constantly seeing this news as well that is heavily portrayed, which just, it's an addiction as well. Human beings, I can speak to you about this forever, Doc, but it's about human beings crave drama.
Yes.
we can dive
drama's
into
addictive, just like social media, just like drugs, and on social media, it's either got to be funny or outrage. Otherwise it doesn't get shared.
Yeah. And it's like that thing that we're often seeing all the time is this negative information is heavily shared on social media. And it really, really bugs me.